It started with a science race 13 years in the making, mapping the majority of the human genome with two entities, the US government-backed Human Genome Project and the privately funded Celera Genomics, announcing the rough draft of their findings in the year 2000. And like ripples in a pond, this major milestone would mark the beginning of a tidal wave of innovation. In the decade that followed, scientists identified the root cause of genetic diseases and tested bold new therapies in the lab with new tools to boot. Academic science built new modalities and they were off to the races. Following that, academia passed the baton to industry, and we saw firsthand how innovation was becoming a reality. And while looking back and taking stock of where we are is important, it's also important to look ahead as we enter the next era of transformative innovation. And that's why I'm so excited to welcome a true innovator, a visionary, my partner and friend, our own Rod Wong, Managing Partner, Chief Investment Officer, and founder of RTW Investments. I'm your host, Stephanie Sirota, Chief Business Officer and Partner at RTW. Today, we're taking you through the evolution of the biotech investment space, and we're going to share with you some bold predictions about where the industry is going and why investors should take note. Rod, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Good to be here.
It's amazing to see how much biotech has evolved over the last 2 decades. Let's take our listeners through that innovation lifecycle and point out the most important takeaways in the last 20 years. You were in med school at Penn when the first genome was sequenced. Can you take us back to that first milestone and tell us why it was so monumental for biotech?
I think it was 99 or 2000 that the first sequence was completed. The government, the Human Genome Project, did it for about $3 billion, and then Celera, the private company, got it done for about $300 million. It took about 15 years before the cost per genome sequence dropped below $1,000. And that's when the downstream benefits of having that information really started to accelerate. So why was it so transformational? It's roughly estimated that about 2/3 of human disease has some kind of genetic contribution to it. So the majority of disease, there's around 10,000 rare diseases in the US. I think if you add them all up together, it's about 10% of the US population. Of those, 80% have some kind of genetic contribution, and another 80% of that, I believe, is monogenic or caused by a single gene. So somewhere north of 5,000 rare diseases are caused by a single genetic mutation. Having that genome sequence basically opens up the understanding of so many of the drivers of human disease and provides innovators with the targets to go after so that then you can develop drugs or cures for those diseases. So it was a hugely enabling step for innovation and one of the major contributors to the boom that we're seeing.
During that time, one of the first gene therapy patients was treated and sadly passed away. So we had this juxtaposition of the greatest potential unlocking of genetic information against brand new technologies in their infancy, years away from prime time.
The very first gene therapy patient was treated by the NIH in 1990. And it was a patient with a very rare immunodeficiency disease called ADA-SCID. But when I was at Penn in 99, there was a patient named Jesse Gelsinger with another rare disease called OTC deficiency that had really a tragic outcome. Jesse was treated with an adenovector, obviously wasn't known prior to him getting treated, but he ended up having what's called a cytokine storm, a really massive immune response that led to multi-organ failure and then tragically him passing away. That was a major moment in gene therapy. In general, the field slowed down before reaccelerating on the back of some improvements to the types of viral vectors that were used a few years later. With gene therapy, it's taken time. It's still trying to figure out some of those challenges. Not every technology at the beginning is ready for prime time.
You're heavily influenced by this renaissance that was happening in the biotech space, the new development, the new access and tools. After med school, you went into investing. So your first portfolio manager job was in 2005, and then you founded RTW in 2009. How would you characterize what made you a successful investor during that first decade, let's say 05 to 2015?
Biotech, honestly, was a pretty small industry at the time. I think the total publicly traded market cap was around 300 billion. 80% of that was in the US, and half of that market cap was for big biotech companies: Genentech, Amgen, Gilead, and Biogen. The way I'd characterize the industry at the time was there was relatively low innovation, especially when you compare it to what we're living in today. As a result, there are relatively few specialist firms doing what we do now. I remember a big fund at the time when I started was like $500 million. I interviewed at a couple of hedge funds that are around that size. I thought it was the hugest thing that you could possibly imagine. And if I remember right, the top couple largest firms were maybe just over $1 to $2 billion. The talent situation I would describe as you had an edge if you had any kind of generalist scientific background. That was enough to have an advantage as a healthcare investor. You honestly didn't even need any financial skills at all. And if you had basic finance or forecasting ability, that was also a major advantage. Me personally, fresh grad, scientific background, had an MBA, working with a small team. That was enough to have major edge in predicting whether science was going to work or whether a market was going to be interesting or not in terms of the size of the business opportunity.
You lived through the GFC and capital was scarce, but you had this huge belief in biotech. How'd you know where to put your money and where to focus your attention?
We kind of tried to comprehensively follow the innovation, and we tried to assess where the odds of success would be higher than average. And a couple of those areas were rare disease and then RNA. And those were the places that had the combination of higher odds of success, as well as there was a business there that you could underwrite that was sizable enough. It was what I was interested in. It was what I was educated for. And honestly, I just really loved the job. Anyone who was picking the ideal industry probably wouldn't have picked biotech to subspecialize in as an investor. It just wasn't a big enough field then. So you had to do it because you enjoyed it. Early in my career, the things that I did have an advantage in so far outweighed the rest. It allowed for us to have some success.
Do you attribute your knowledge of the fundamental science to keeping your footing even when the markets were wild? During the global financial crisis, the 2015-16 period, Valiant came crashing down. Theranos was exposed as a fraud, and Hillary's famous tweets on drug pricing really rocked the sector. Nobody wanted biotech.
When you've been in this business for as long as I have, you kind of have known pain. The financial crisis was not long after I was in the business. And so we know what humble times look like. The decade from kind of 2015 to now, that was a super interesting time because in contrast to when I started, innovation was starting to accelerate. You had this bull market for a period where you saw an explosion of new modalities, right? We only mentioned one of them so far, which is RNA. But there are about half dozen others, many of which we talk about all the time, like gene therapy, cell therapy, protein degraders, ADCs, radiotherapy. All these modalities kind of hit the scene during that time. That transitioned to a bear market. Both the tail of the boom and the bear market were amplified by a couple things. One was COVID, and then also the crash because of the reversal. And it was also amplified by drug policy. The second half of that decade, you had a very high amount of policy uncertainty and actual change. You had the passage of the IRA. I think anyone who's been doing this business a long time needs to be used to it, needs to know how to navigate those kinds of things top down. I think there are investors that always see opportunity in bear markets if they have a fundamental value framework, for example. And that's our investment style as well. So as terrifying and challenging bear markets are, they're also the time where I see some of the most opportunity. And so that's a reason to be excited and a reason to stay really interested in the job.
Well, you clearly did, because during that bear market is when you really kind of doubled down and reinvested in the firm and took the firm through a major growth spurt, not just, headcount, but, you grew AUM. You invested across important subsector specialization, but also new functional areas. I'm curious, do you see yourself now as a business builder or an investor? Clearly both, but where does that line blur?
I've always thought of myself first and foremost as an investor. I had to become a business builder to do what we did. Our growth was significant. And during that period, for part of it, I had to be a very hands-on manager. Now, I'm very happy that that period of my career is past now. And I've been able to refocus not just as an investor, but then retain the parts of a business builder that I actually enjoy and think I have some talent for, which is the strategy piece, right? So I'm trying to focus on just hanging on to strategy and pushing as much management to professionals as possible.
That first decade was the decade of discovery, followed by the next decade was this decade of development. Tell us what's next.
We are at a super interesting inflection point, the direct progression from the boom in early stage science. Some of that science matured successfully, and the result is you're getting more new drugs across the finish line than ever, and businesses that emerge from those successful products. This next decade will be not the decade of early stage science, but will be the decade of commercialization and successful businesses being born from that science. That is a super exciting phase to have as many transformative medicines as possible to make a dent in human disease. Exciting early stage science is simply a stepping stone to that end goal.
Many investors still think about biotech as this pre-revenue, high-risk science project. Now you're saying that they should really reframe their understanding of the sector today. The top and largest biotech companies, Amgen and Gilead and Biogen and Genentech, have you seen new entrants in that space?
The total industry cap now is a little shy of 1.5 trillion, so it's up about 4 to 5x. Also, the concentration is less. So it's about twice as many names now that make up half of the market cap. You're seeing the leadership of the sector broaden out. And I think that's going to continue. The industry is going to grow even faster over the next decade. And that leadership is going to be even broader. When we have conversations with our investors, we like to bring up this one example, which is that the brand names in biotech, that list has been relatively static for 20 plus years. But for the first time, that list is changing, and many people are still not aware of companies like Argenx or Alnylam or Insmed or B1. All of those companies have now larger market caps than Biogen, right, which was one of the big four when I started in the business. I think that trend is only going to continue and probably accelerate.
With the convergence of technology and AI, do you think investors that once focused on tech will see the potential on the scientific tech?
Our friends in tech bring a different lens to our sector. Some folks are getting excited about our sector again, about the potential that AI has on drug discovery specifically. It's going to be the most significant thing to impact research productivity in our space since the genome. And maybe the impact will end up being even bigger. Our industry spends the highest proportion of revenue on R&D of any industry, I think. It's roughly 25% for the large cap companies. I believe the next highest are chip companies, software companies that spend, a little bit more than half of that percent of revenues on R&D. But bottom line is, our industry spends an enormous amount because R&D in our space has been historically a really, really difficult low return exercise. The failure rate's 90%. It historically took over a dozen years from the beginning to the end of the process. If AI can increase productivity in terms of odds, timelines, quality of the product that you get out the other end, you think about the big picture impact that could have on an industry that spends 25% of revenues on R&D. If productivity is increased, you get more revenue for that 25%. So the growth increases. The other possibility is you don't have to spend 25% on your revenue to get the same business result, and then maybe you look a little bit more like some of these other industries, more efficient use or output out of R&D. And if that happens, I think perception of our industry could change a lot.
It sounds like we're sitting on a volcano of potential from a valuation perspective, but also a next wave of value creation from great new drugs. Where do you see that next wave coming from?
These modalities that we talked about, many of them are maturing. They're all different in terms of how broad their applicability is, how much new product ultimately that they can produce. Holistically, as a group, you're going to see record-setting numbers of new products and then the promising businesses from that 5-10 years down the line.
Sometimes people say, I've gotten burned in biotech and I don't want to touch it again. It is a sector that can be very cyclical. Maybe tell us a little bit about your views on risk management and conviction when sentiment turns against the sector, because that's what we've been living with for the last few years. And now it's starting to turn in the right direction.
The number one thing you can do in terms of risk management is to generate alpha. This is a space that remains highly inefficient. And so if you can generate consistent alpha, that is your best margin of safety in downtimes for the market or the sector. You want to pick investments with a favorable up-down or risk reward. So even if you transition from a bull market to a bear market, you get some margin of safety from being disciplined in terms of your valuation framework. And you get conviction as well when your investments move against you that you won't make portfolio management or trading mistakes. We have one fund where we have the flexibility to adjust our gross and our net exposure, especially our net exposure. Generally speaking, in periods of high valuation, we can reduce that net exposure to the market and reduce our losses if the market was to transition from one stage of the cycle to another.
Generating alpha is the basic principle of what we're designed to do as an investment firm. The prevailing wisdom has always been invest in the science and then sell the launch. But your rebuttal to that is like we're entering this new era of commercialization. Maybe talk to us about some of the other areas that here at RTW we like to refer to as alpha stacking, where you've been able to gain edge as an investor outside of science, which is obviously fundamental.
If you look at a lot of what made investors in our space successful over the last decade or so is the ability to underwrite early stage science. That's always going to be valuable. Being comfortable and knowing what you're doing when companies are at commercial stage is going to be an increasingly valuable skill set. For us, for example, we're talking about portfolio construction. Today, a majority of our investments are in commercial stage companies. So having deep expertise in commercial forecasting of those kinds of businesses is critical right now. And I think is going to be a huge driver of who succeeds in the next decade. This term alpha stacking, big picture, find as many potential sources of alpha as possible. You want to test them, right? And then if it looks like a real source of alpha, you want to maximize that advantage. And we take that intentional approach to everything that we do. The two biggest buckets, underwriting science, underwriting commercial. There's other things that are very complementary to that. We had the foresight to stand up a government affairs function when Trump won the election. And it's been incredibly valuable, right, to have that to help us navigate that policy uncertainty. That's not something you would think of as a key source of alpha in most environments. Because of the way we're organized and the way we think about alpha, we could jump on it when we saw the opportunity and then capitalize on it.
That's great.
Maybe before we wrap up, let's flip the script a little bit. I know you've been fielding a lot of questions about a couple topics. Longevity, preventive medicine has become buzzwords that we hear about a lot, especially from our friends in tech. What do you think is real? What's hype?
People like the concept of, longevity, preventive medicines, thinking about real impact to one's health span outside of lifespan, but buzzwords are not businesses. That's not treating disease, which is what our business today is designed to do, to really interrogate science and then evaluate how big some of these opportunities are. For longevity, the biggest gift that society was just given, and now at a reduced rate for non-insured patients, is the GLPs. So Lilly going direct to consumer and Novo, all of those new drugs for weight loss have, a tremendous impact. That is going to help, I think, a lot of people live longer and be healthier while they are alive. On the preventative medicine side, there's not a lot of medical school that's really focused on how to live healthier, things like nutrition or sleep, fitness. They're certainly important, and people, should absolutely educate themselves and adopt the healthiest practices. But for right now, they're lifestyles and they're not real businesses that are investable from our perspective.
Along those same lines, what about in these adjacencies to healthcare? Trends like wearables, biomarkers that give people the ability to monitor their own wellness and in some cases manage their chronic diseases.
So many conversations that I have outside of just, the business setting are on health and tech and consumer. And that convergence is upon us. I think we're just beginning. So I'm actually really excited about the opportunities that are emerging in that space. I said that preventative medicine is not a business, but maybe it's not a business yet. The opportunity is not fully crystallized, but it's coming.
Totally agree. And we are following some businesses like that right now in our medtech practice.
That's right. With the AI impact, I think there's going to be a lot more to say when people start tracking their own metrics.
And then maybe shifting gears, what's new in terms of the investor allocator landscape? What kind of people are you talking to right now? Where's interest in our sector coming from?
It's so exciting. This is going to be a whole new chapter in capital that can come into this sector and fund tomorrow's innovation. And that's coming from private wealth, private bank clients, high net worth investors, retail. I think this also is part of the convergence trade, because as people hear more about how important this opportunity is, how impactful biotech, health, and biopharma is on society and in our portfolios, I think people are getting a lot wiser to that. So we're having a lot of conversations with private bankers, with financial advisors, and expect a lot of private wealth money to come into the space. Okay, so with all that talk, if you want to look ahead 10 years, what headline would you like to read about biotech or RTW in 2035?
If the headlines are, the number of novel new medicines reaching patients every year is double each year from what it is today, if the efficiency of drug discovery has improved dramatically thanks to everything we've talked about, including AI, so that these businesses become more predictable, higher growth businesses, I think that would be great for the industry. It'd be great for health. For RTW, our goal is to work with the most promising entrepreneurs and companies with the most promising drugs in development and on the market and help them on the journey, of course, by providing capital, but also we do it in other ways too. I would love it if we play a role in broadening understanding and interest in our space. I actually have a new book out that covers a lot of the issues we've been talking about. It's actually a healthcare policy book focused on innovation. So for people who are interested, they can actually go to the website and find out how to get it.
Innovation is the best medicine.
That's the title.
This is going to be an essential read for anyone that wants to learn more about biotech. If I may, I would like to just add one thing to what I would also like to read about in 10 years for the sector, but also RTW. And I say this coming from my career as an investment banker and getting a master's in journalism. There are a lot of avenues and there are a lot of ways to have a role in this sector and in our business too, because we need storytellers, we need capital raisers, we need deal makers, we need strategic thinkers, we need people with legal backgrounds. There is a lot more than the primary science piece. So the industry is open for business and it's really welcoming to a lot of smart people to join us. Rod, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insight on biotech's next frontier.
No, thanks a lot. It was fun.